I just might suggest that next time you schedule me for the middle of winter, because it's nicer to leave dark and it's cold Sweden in the middle of winter. But okay. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here and be able to sort of like summarize some of my own thinking and thinking of others. Kostis asked me originally to present an overview of radical geography and ecology, and so I was thinking this was, just a seminar with students, and then I realized it's in this series, so I really felt like I really needed to do my homework. So the title we landed with is Radical Geography and Ecology, the Commodification of Nature. And commodification of space is something that I've been engaged in together with many others for a very long time. And I want to start off just by sort of orienting in the landscape where I'm coming from with these keywords in the title. With radical geography, I think it's important to understand that we have to go outside of geography. We have to be radically post-disciplinarian, because I don't think you can really be radical if you're going to stay within the confines of a discipline. And of course that also involves asking radical questions that call for radical answers. But in order to do that, we necessarily stretch outside of the confines of disciplines. And of course, if we read some of the most inspirational work that we all read, we understand very soon that, of course, we seek nourishment in our thinking from other directions. When it comes to ecology, I want to emphasize that my own look on this, and you'll notice from the literature I sent out, and also from quite much of what I'll be saying, that I'm pretty much consider myself a disciple of David Harvey. And so I'll draw on some of Harvey's formulations here with regards to ecology as point of departure, that when he says that there's nothing unnatural about New York City. And so then he sort of like jostles us a little bit. Wake up here now, there's nothing unnatural about New York City. And he continues by pointing out that the circulation of money and of capital have to be construed as ecological variables, every bit as much as we conceptualize the circulation of air and water as part of the ecology. So ecology has to be understood as including social relations. Commodification has to do with making things into commodities that earlier were not considered commodities. That means institutionalizing markets. This often involves violence. So it's not such a peaceful endeavor as is often pointed out. It's nowadays, at least it seems sometimes at the darkest moments, it feels like the water we're swimming in now is neoliberal. And the neoliberal water that we swim in, waters are natural. Markets are natural. Markets are the pre-political condition. They are before everything else. They're natural. And this is something that is, I'm going to get back to. It's as when it comes to this thing with how ideas form our directions in our politics. But so I won't say much more by way of introduction about commodification, more than that it's so basic to understanding what's going on ecologically, socially, and politically. Today, nature, the commodification of nature, again relating to ecology. I just preface by again going back to Raymond Williams' work on keywords. This is probably one of the most quoted passages in keywords, is where he deals with nature and says that it's very complicated. And indeed it is. I'm not going to land here with some sort of a definition that will land somewhere within Raymond Williams' fascinating essay. But the one thing I want to say is that whenever I use nature, whenever we think about nature, we need to see it as not external. We need to include ourselves in it. We are very much part of nature. And again, so there's nothing unnatural about Athens. And this allows me to see processes like gentrification as indeed connected to other forms of commodification of nature, and to draw parallels. Prelude. Now I want to start with just a little story that has to do with the politics of ecological thinking today and the commodification of nature in a very urban context. And it has to do with ecologically unequal exchange. This is a concept that I'm sure you're familiar with, but it has to do with unequal exchange, but with an ecological prefix. And it basically has to do with material flows and seeing how trade is not quite so neutral as it's commonly perceived in the mainstream economic literature. Trade is only something good. Everyone benefits from it. We wouldn't trade if we didn't consider it good. And so trade is really just wonderful. But if you look at the material flows that trade involves, and you study what happens, then you find that these often have ecologically very unequal consequences across global space. And one of my colleagues, Alf Hornborg, has worked very much on this, and I've joined him in a project where I've tried to make some sort of research into ecologically unequal exchange, focusing on islands, which are sort of easy to focus on because it's easy to pretend that they're bounded spaces, which they never are. But I said I was going to start with a story from an urban context, and I want to tell about something that happened that sort of made me realize just how powerful the forces are that we're up against. So we're in Stockholm 3 years ago, and Stockholm has been designated the green capital of Europe. Okay, so Stockholm can sell itself as being very green. And I was invited to with a few other speakers to talk 10 minutes in a public debate in connection with the grand opening of this. And I used my 10 minutes to try to problematize this thing with how green is Stockholm. I mean, let's start, if you're an economic geographer, we can look at commodity chains, okay? Commodity chains might be some way for an economic geographer to begin to get close to what is meant by ecologically unequal exchange. And I try to suggest that all the consumption that's going on in Stockholm, well, all the wonderful cars and electronic devices that are flowing in and out of Stockholm in the form of waste at the end, but coming in as polished, nice, glittery objects that we consume. And also the cornflakes and the medicine, because there are rivers in India with no frogs and fish. And that's because of medical production that is keeping us healthy in Stockholm. Okay, so and I tried to point this out, and 10 minutes over, fine. And then the vice mayor comes in, and in a 5-minute talk, 3 times in 5 minutes, manages to tell everyone just how wonderful it is, because this shows that we can combine growth and sustainable development. This shows that we can combine growth and sustainable development. And a third time. And what is it? Well, because the CO2 emissions in Stockholm have gone down at the same time as the population has gone up. Isn't that wonderful? Look at this. Stockholm proves that we can combine growth with sustainable development. So forget about ecologically unequal exchange, commodity chains, and all the rest of it. So what Stockholm can do is brand itself as green. And so it is commodifying itself. This is what Harvey talks about when he's problematizing how the commons is privatized and commodified. And it's commodified at different scales. So this is an example at a pretty large scale where, thanks to Stockholm being green, we can brand space. We are commodifying it. Why does Stockholm get this award? Well, there are these brand new, technologically advanced residential developments, 2 or 3 flagship developments in Stockholm. and there have been theses written about this, and the engineers come in, and the biologists come in, and the chemists come in, and everything is scientifically, impeccably, wonderfully green. But nothing about the lifestyle of the people that move in. Nothing about what kind of lifestyle you lead if you are able to afford to get into one of these green developments. So these I mean, the price of these, speaking of commodification, the price of living in these goes up because it's branded as green. So even without the offset markets and the CO2 markets and those, even without that, there's some commodification of space going on that has to do with nature and the idea that nature can be commodified. So after that, I mean, for me that was sort of like an example. I mean, everyone listens to the mayor and believes it. This is great. We can combine growth and sustainable development. Stockholm is right there on the frontier. This is, you know, we're going to save the planet this way. And it's deeply problematic, deeply problematic. And I would like to think that something so simple, you know, there's this classic example, Harvey uses it, many economic geographers use it. Where did your breakfast come from? Right? Okay? So then you start thinking about commodity change. You'd think that ecologically unequal exchange would be easy to sort of like imagine and begin to see how problematic it is to actually talk about local sustainable development, or that a city can be sustainable, because it's not a question that cities can't be sustainable, but to be able to, I mean, you're constricting your thought if you think that you can enclose a city and call it green, because the metabolism of that city stretches all over the planet. So basically, I think there's only one scale where it's reasonable to talk about it, and that is global. Now for the, oh my Lord.
What?
I've been taking too much time. You wanted me to finish at 8. Okay. For the remainder of my talk, I want to paint a picture of a figure in David Harvey's companion to Marx Capital in chapter 7, which is called What Technology Reveals. He has a figure with 6 fields, and they're connected. Now, they're not arrows, because this isn't necessarily causal relations. They're dialectical relations. And when I saw this, it popped out at me, because for me it looked very similar to a figure in Richard Nordort's book, Development Betrayed, which is also very much about, and David Harvey uses this concept, coevolution. These dimensions of social existence and ecology co-evolve, and what they are technology, social relations, modes of production, the reproduction of daily life. And I'm saving the most two important from what my reading of Harvey is, he says these are all equally important, and it's a mistake in social theory to overemphasize one. But I constantly see in my own thinking and in others that relation to nature and mental conceptions of the world seem to at least, and where we are now in our context now, seem to be making the most difference. And he calls these elements, moments, spheres of activity in a social ecological totality of ensembles or assemblages in an open coevolutionary process. So what I find intriguing about this, partly Harvey emphasizes how there's an importation of metaphors from social life into science, which warps our understandings of nature. So, and he has these examples, Darwin and Malthus and whatnot, where gendered class perspectives of social relations just sort of translate into our scientific conceptions of nature. Equally important, I think, is how technologies and how we organize and institutionalize social life, they don't just rain down on us. They are something that we create. We produce technologies and organization and institutions, and we are guided by our mental conceptions when we do that. And this, I think, is something that is very important to keep in mind, this constellation of co-evolving dimensions. So this thing with guiding metaphors, the metaphors that we can't be without, because we really can't think without metaphors. Andrew Sayre defines science as basically the effort to try to improve our metaphors. And that's basically, I guess, what science is about, or good thinking, you know. So which metaphors can be most sort of felicitous, which can be guide us best? And if we look into the ecological debate and discourse, we find a whole pile of rather disturbing guiding metaphors. We have over the cliff. We're going over the cliff. Any minute now, we're going over the cliff. There's scarcity, eco-scarcity. We have Jared Diamond's collapse. I don't know, he doesn't have a monopoly on that, because there's a lot about collapse. We are just about to collapse, and we can study societies that have collapsed. And collapse is sort of like something that we can get nervous about. There are limits. There's the apocalyptic destruction of nature. There's the end of nature. In the IPCC, we have the burning embers, and we have tipping points. These are the metaphors that are used about ecological discourse today, and they really dominate how we talk about it. And it's problematic, and there are quite many people that are problematizing this, not only Harvey, but so there was a recent article in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society that problematizes the catastrophic framings of climate change, saying that it blocks more sustainable political pathways because it blocks deeper societal engagement. It disempowers us. We fall into a fatalism, a denial, or an apathy, which is problematic. Already 20 years ago, Bauman wrote in the Times Higher Education supplement about the solution as a problem, that catastrophes most horrid are often born out of the war against catastrophes. And here we come into the issue that Eric Swingedow and many others are bringing up, that this also is very conducive to post-politics. You know, it inhibits political thinking and action because it's so catastrophic. So our hands are tied, and we have to let the geophysicists and the economists solve this for us in a very authoritarian way. So we have a problem here also with the knowledge hierarchy, because the ecological problems, for instance, climate change, become something that are defined and policies are designed through being informed by the geosciences and economics more than anything else. The geosciences tell us all the technical details, very much of it, which is very interesting and relevant for sure, and the economists tell us how to solve it, and perhaps some geoscientists are also finding the engineer solution to it. And then, since it's so catastrophic and important, then we can count on more funding and perhaps greater prestige in our career. So what Harvey does in a chapter from 1999, actually, in an edited volume, Nicholas Lowe's edited volume, Global Ethics and Environment, he argues for a more useful metaphor, and he says it's far more consistent with the general thrust of environmental thinking to construe ourselves as embedded within an ongoing flow of living processes that we can individually and collectively affect through actions at the same time as we are profoundly affected by all manner of events within the world we inhabit. To construe ourselves as active agents caught within the web of life is a much more useful metaphor. This is a way of thinking that in one of the articles that I have on the list that I wrote together with my brother, who's a psychologist, that we really try to sort of underscore. The way we think about ourselves is very, very important. How we conceptualize who we are, and also how we fit into this, what Harvey calls the web of life. We're active agents in this. We aren't outside of nature. And so I'm going to get back to that in just a moment after saying a little bit more about this thing with commodification, because one of the major forces driving commodification of nature today is finance capital. And this process that has come to be called financialization. The literature is mushrooming, and very much of it, I think, stays within a pretty sort of the confines of economic thinking. What is financialization? It's a pattern of accumulation in which profit making occurs increasingly through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. So more and more profit is through financial speculation and financial trade rather than what's called the real economy. There's an ascendancy of shareholder value as a mode of corporate governance. There's an increasing political and economic power of the rentier class, and so on. We have rapid financial innovations and whatnot. Now, a number of years ago, I was doing work in Copenhagen with Anders Lund, where we were looking at changes in the commercial property market and trying to figure out what were the consequences of the financialization of the commercial property market for urban politics. There we see the financialization of land as a move towards taking something that's solid and making it liquid. It's the liquidification of property capital, turning it into stocks and securities that can be traded. And thousands of trades per second nowadays. So it really sort of revolutionizes the property market. And the four main characteristics that we found then was that what it involves is a divisibility of investment. Rather than buying a whole property that's chunky, in the economic term chunky, it becomes highly divisible into small, minuscule fragments. Risk is spread because we put these minuscule fragments into portfolios. And so you don't need to buy one property. You can buy shares in many properties. There's a separation of investment from the function of sort of securing local knowledge. I don't need to know about the place I invest. And believe it or not, all of us are part of this, at least if you have any money at all in a pension fund, because the pension funds are the biggest sort of investors in these portfolios. And so what we get is a very marked increase in the ease of entrance and exit in the property market. And what we consider usually as very fixed capital buildings, they become very liquid. And the consequences we found in Copenhagen then were that it had quite much impact on urban politics, because what it involves is more and more this idea that our hands are tied. We need to compete for free-floating capital, and so we need to sort of like bend and twist and turn in order to facilitate this inflow of capital, because it's the inflow of capital we want. And then in order to do that, we need to sort of like cater to the right people. So it has consequences for social geography in Copenhagen, because all of a sudden we get this idea that we need to attract the economically sustainable population. So sustainability comes in here also in a very, very perverse way when we start talking about some people are economically sustainable and some people are not. So we have this idea of getting rid of the trash and attracting the right people who can be sustainable. And this is very much part of it's basic to my work in gentrification has been this idea that the underlying structure that is necessary for the rent gap mechanism to work is the commodification of space. If it's not commodified, then there's not a market for it. And if there's not a market for it, then we won't get the rent gap mechanism. And I won't dwell too much more on rent, but Michael Edwards was here, and so you've been thoroughly introduced to rent theory. I just get sort of pleased myself when Harvey in The Enigma of Capital emphasizes that rent has to be brought forward into the forefront of analysis rather than being treated as a derivative category. Only in this way can we bring together an understanding of the ongoing production of space and geography and the circulation and accumulation of capital, and put them in relation to processes of crisis formation where they so clearly belong. And in connection with that, I think it's important to emphasize that the search for rent creates a premium on commodification. So when what Cindy Katz calls vagabond capital is roaming the earth looking for rent, it constitutes a pressure to commodify more and more of what it can, and institutionalize new markets where it can penetrate and find new sources of rent income. And one of the ways it does this is by taking the commons that is constantly being produced. We are constantly producing commons through our social activity and commodifying it too. So in Rebel Cities, Harvey says that those of us who create an interesting and stimulating place, if we are successful in creating an interesting and stimulating place, then we will lose it to the predatory practices of the real estate entrepreneurs, the financiers, and upper class consumers. And he says the better the common qualities a social group creates, the more likely it is to be rated and appropriated. So he identifies what he calls, and this is also, I think, very, very basic to this commodification of nature. And it's taken in again in an urban context, but it's the same thing going on with land in Africa and mining all over the planet, and what we usually think of as the extraction from nature. And that is what he calls the singular principal power. The singular principal power. And what is that? That's the landed developer interest. So first you own it, and then you develop it, and then you get rental income. This isn't a place that can be owned. Well, let's institutionalize private property rights. This is what's going on in the oceans now. So we're institutionalizing the private ownership of our oceans, and that allows for capital to go in and accumulate by dispossession. Small-scale fishery is disappearing at a very rapid rate, being displaced. Now here I want to draw a parallel to someone else who's been quite much of an inspiration for me, Torsten Hägerstrand in Sweden. His posthumously published book is called The Weave of Existence. It's in Swedish, but translated The Weave of Existence. And there he's very careful with hypotheses, because he's a little bit like Harvey. He's a synthesizer and a little bit more looking at something more dialectically than that. But he uses hypothesis twice in the book. And the one place is, the hypothesis is that the way space is acquired, held, and used is the key to how the weave of existence is formed into the future. So we are part of this weave, and how space is acquired This is the important part for me. How space is acquired, held, and used is the key to how this weave develops. And there's nothing predetermined about it, although there are pathways that are closed off. So we can't do like this and everything is changed. But there are also openings in this. And I would really like to, relate this notion of accumulation by dispossession to a much earlier work by Karl Polanyi in his The Great Transformation. He has a chapter there which is called Habitation versus Improvement. Habitation versus improvement. And for me, this is just a wonderful sort of like reformulation of, if you will, present users, nature, whatever, what's there, and improvement. And Karl Polanyi talks about to protect their habitation against the juggernaut improvement. The juggernaut improvement. Now, Marx talks about the juggernaut capital. And if you look in the history of how Polanyi's work was written, he was trying to write, if you will, in a socialist Marxist theory, but without using the concepts that would be difficult to get people to think. So it's also, I find just fascinating if you revisit Raymond Williams. I mentioned earlier his keywords. One of the keywords he has there is improve. And the actual history, the social history of the notion to improve comes from the investment of capital to land. And but anyway, this is identifying a struggle where there's a juggernaut and it's improvement. And arguing against improvement is very difficult. So it's like arguing against revitalization and regeneration. You know, don't we all want to have vital places? Of course we do. And then it becomes hard to actually observe and see what's happening. Maybe Harvey's correct that this isn't revitalization, this is devitalization, and so on. But it also, I'm running short on time here because, so I see I need to move ahead. One of the things that I think is really come to dominate the discourse now globally and in the scientific literature when it comes to the commodification of nature has to do with this thing of ecosystem services. Now the very notion of ecosystem services is, if you will, conceiving of nature, the planet, as something that is providing us services. So we get markets in these ecosystem services. We get markets for biodiversity offsets, CO2 offsets, wild bird offsets, environmental derivatives, and these markets are mushrooming. And what finance capital does is, just like it does with property, it unbundles it, puts it into little portfolios, and you create environmental derivatives, so that there's speculation on whether these are going to go up or down in value. So value is being created in nature, where it earlier, and it's an exchange value. Whereas earlier it was, and I'm trying to find, because there was one place where Morgan Robertson I can't find it, quotes from the first sentence of Capital and changes the wording. Apparently I missed that. But what it comes down to is that capitalism treats many of the fundamental elements of the web of life, treats it as if it was commodities. when they are not produced as commodities. This is what Carl Planning means when he talks about fictitious commodities. This is where we can see how what Neil Smith means when he talks about the production of nature all the way down. So finance capital is penetrating right into the water we drink, the air we breathe, the nature reserves, and right in also into our genes and the songs we sing and so on. And perhaps most remarkable about this is that the landowners are presented as the providers of the ecosystem services. So they are sort of the representatives of nature. They're the ones that get to take the payment for the service, since they own it. So here we can see again how rent comes into this, because it just might be that the highest and best use of this piece of land is to be a CO2 offset, or to be a wild bird offset. And if that's the highest and best use according to finance capital, then we can't argue against it. And it doesn't much matter if it's displacing people or displacing whole cultures that have been using the land for many generations. So now we have we have things like natural capital committees, we have ecosystem markets task forces, and their task is to engineer new markets. And again, markets are created, they aren't natural. And very often it's a very painful process to do so. One of the points that I think is coming out of the literature on neoliberalism, thankfully, is the realization that neoliberalism isn't deregulation, it's re-engineering. It's creating markets, and in order to do that, we have to regulate. These are highly regulated things. It's just that they're regulated to benefit certain agents and at the cost of others. So it's in a way something that I think many of the proponents of neoliberal politics like to keep the debate in this thing with deregulation or not, because as long as we stay there, then we're not realizing that there's an authoritative state behind the engineering of these new markets, and that actually neoliberal deviates very much from the old liberals two centuries ago. I'm coming down the home stretch. Last sheet of paper here. But I want to get back to this thing with mental conceptions and relation to nature in Harvey's coevolutionary diagram. And one of the points that I make with my brother in the Transactions article on participation in evolution is that knowledge is not innocent. What we think we know is not innocent. So, for instance, and there's a lot of research that backs this up, if we know that intelligence is fixed, then it inhibits learning. If we know that personality attributes are inherited, that impels hasty, negative judgments about others. And it forecloses opportunities for constructive encounter. If we know that free will is illusory, that engenders cheating and aggression. And if we know that humans are selfish by their very nature, that favors policies that crowd out reciprocity and trust and induces self-interested behavior. Knowing that political dispositions are a genetic endowment sells short political prospects. Now you may think that's an absurd, but there's research that says that there's a political gene and our political activity is genetic. It's mind-boggling. So these deterministic formulations of ourselves, whether environmental or genetic, they become self-imposed constraints, just as interpretations of history are themselves forces of history. So what we believe about history, that becomes a force of history. And what we think we know about ourselves, that influences the, if you will, degrees of freedom that we have to create a different world. We refer in that work to some very fascinating work done by researchers that are looking into our deep past, who we are. Now, I don't think that we can necessarily answer who we are by looking into our deep past, but it doesn't hurt and it can help, because there's so much sort of tacit understanding about human nature that really is important to sort of problematize. Christopher Boom has been studying our closest relatives, and he emphasizes, and the sort of the transition to Homo sapiens, and he emphasizes the role of moral sanctioning in creating and maintaining egalitarian dispositions. And he argues that humans, that we invented egalitarian politics by intentional cultural practices, and thereby created what he calls a major social structural divergence at the level of phenotype. Basically, that's when Homo sapiens became Homo sapiens. The examples he gives, well, they are, if there's a psychopath in our group and they're dangerous for our group, guess what? There's a hunting accident. They're pushed over a cliff. They're pushed off the ice floe. That kind of behavior is not tolerated. And this is what he means by egalitarian politics. And there are a lot of people through our history, our deep history, that have experienced this. Now we live in a world governed by corporate capital. You've seen maybe the studies that show that corporate actors are basically psychopaths. And we're not pushing them off the cliff. And there aren't any hunting accidents. And I'm not going to stand here and seriously suggest that we should see to it that there are hunting accidents. So please take that metaphorically, okay? But I agree with our friend Andrew Sayer, who in a short article in Area about radical geography and CO2 global warming, says that cutting greenhouse gas emissions on a scale sufficient to halt global warming requires major leveling down of income. And he says the world cannot afford the rich. The world cannot afford the rich. So maybe it's time we start seeing ourselves like Christopher Boom suggests. We see ourselves that we are the innovative creators of egalitarian politics. This is who we are. And if our ancestors were not so good at doing that, we wouldn't be here. Andrew Sayer also has a very interesting argument about twisting the Lockean proviso, which resembles when Harvey says taking the neoliberal ideology and throwing it back in their face. Because actually, if you take the Lockean proviso seriously, then the very rich should definitely be dispossessed immediately. I wanted to close with another story from that in a way is related to deep time and history and nature and what. It's one of my favorite stories. It comes from Pyotr Kropotkin's Mutual Aid. You're familiar with Pyotr Kropotkin, often considered a predecessor to radical geography. And in Mutual Aid, and I think it's the introduction or perhaps the first chapter, he tells a story about going into the Museum of Natural History in Sussex, I think it was, never mind, south coast of England. And he makes observations there because he's not as wealthy as Darwin, so he can't take ships around the planet and studied. So he goes to, that's what natural museums were for. They were for research at that time. And when he goes in, he sees that there's a tank with horseshoe crabs, and there's a horseshoe crab who's upside down. And because of a metal bar, is unable to turn back up. And what he sees is that there's another horseshoe crab helping the helpless horseshoe crab. And then he goes into the museum and he does his 2-3 hours of observation, and then he comes out, and on the way out, he sees that there's 3 or 4 horseshoe crabs helping the helpless horseshoe crab. Now the horseshoe crab goes back, I don't remember the exact figures, but let's just say a few 100 million years. These are ancient animals, okay? For Kropotkin, this was an instance, this was, if you will, a little fragment of evidence that there's something here that's deep in nature that has to do with solidarity. Yeah? And I think that's okay. We aren't horseshoe crabs, but in a way you can say we've taken that and we've run with the ball, and we've gone pretty far with that. So, especially if you believe the work of Christopher Boehm. And I want to end by emphasizing a couple points that have to do more with issues about democracy when it comes to ecology and commodification of nature. At the AAG in New York, a little over a year ago, Mark Purcell, who's written very interesting work on democracy, he gave a talk that I found especially inspirational. And there he said, he mentioned about the work of David Foster Wallace, who was a writer, so it's novels. He says David Foster Wallace explores how much effort it takes and just how hard it is to become active and to become democratic, to truly manage your affairs for yourselves. And I think that one of the key things that Wallace offers us is the insight that the struggle is not so much against some outside power that doesn't want us to be democratic. It's against the desire within ourselves to become passive and become ruled by an oligarchy. And he emphasized the struggle has to be both individual and collective. That's, I thought, was pretty daring to say in front of, I don't know, 500-600 people, because we had to move it into the ballroom place. This was the sessions on the right to the city. I was very happy to see how many people came to that session. I thought it was daring to say this is an individual struggle also. Why is it that we tend to be passive? How difficult is it to be active? So I immediately went out and started reading David Foster Wallace, and he writes big fat novels. So I won't start reading from him, but one of the shorter things he does, you can find this on the internet. It's a speech. It's a speech, and it's called "This Is Water." Read it. It's great stuff. And in the end of that speech, he says it's unimaginably hard to do this, to live consciously day in and day out. How do we get out of the water that we're swimming in? How do we do that? This is one of the things that I find inspirational about, for instance, the most interesting intellectual laboring that we come across when we work is that it opens up. We see that, we can see things differently. And so Harvey in The Enigma says that the self-organizing powers of people in the daily situations in which they live has to be the basis for any anti-capitalist alternative. This reflects, I think, a little bit on what Mark Purcell and David Foster Wallace were saying. It's in the self-organization powers that we have in our everyday lives. And we need to get over this strong tendency to want to be passive. And I want to end again, I'm ending in several ways, with when Neil Smith, who as you all know, very sadly passed away way too early, he asked at the end of his article, on nature as an accumulation strategy, he asked this question about democracy, and I think it's an important one. So what would a truly democratic production of nature look like? What would a truly democratic production of nature look like? What kind of social power will it take to democratize the production of nature, including our inner cities? And time is short, fortunately. I'm going to end by saying that my answer, in my answer to that question, which is a very difficult question, I just want to throw out a little fragment here. This would require this kind of social power that it takes to democratize the production of nature. It would require, I think, widespread spiritual awakening. Thank you.